Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Naso, and there are a number of topics discussed in this week's portion, but there seems to be a theme through a couple of them, also including this week's Haftarah, the reading that we have from the prophets, which emphasize hair. First of all, we have the Nazir. The Nazir is someone who, for the time that he commits himself to being a Nazarene, is not allowed to drink wine, not allowed to come in contact with death, and we also have a law that he's not supposed to cut his hair. He or she should not cut their hair. But after the period of Nazirus ends, then the hair has to be cut completely. We also have a section in this week's portion which deals with a sota, with a woman who strays from her husband. Her husband is jealous that he sees her with another man, and he makes her drink this water in the temple, and part of the ritual is the uncovering of the hair of the woman. We also have in the Haftarah the story of Samson, the most famous Nazir, which has a lot of different rules than the regular Nazir, but at the end of the day, one of the most important features of Samson, of Shimshon, is the fact that his hair is never cut during his lifetime until Delilah cuts his hair. And somehow, in that story, his hair is associated with strength, and the cutting of his hair removes his strength. The question is if there's any theme to this idea of hair, and if there's any symbolism. So at first glance, if you're reading the Torah from a purely historical point of view, you might suggest that the cutting of the hair has to do with cleanliness, and when the Nazir is finished, it's sort of a purifying ritual where he cuts all of his hair and therefore removes all possibility of uncleanliness. But I'd like to look at it from a symbolic point of view. And if you start to think about it, you think of hair and the people that grow hair or cut their hair that we're familiar with. You think of the hippies of the 60s, they let their hair grow wild. You think of skinheads or Nazi or people in the army, and they have to shave their hair, they have to cut their hair very close. You think of religious Jews and you think of Hasidim, you think of wild beards that are never cut, and payas on the side, which seem to be never cut. And then on their hair, on their head, they cut short. So there's, on the one hand, they're cutting their hair short, on the other hand, they're letting their beards grow wild. So I think a simple symbolism is that hair represents nature uncontrolled. And therefore, when it talks about, for example, a woman who is a sota, who is somebody who was either cheating or acting inappropriately with another man, what do? We focus on her hair. One of the things we do is focus on her hair and say that her hair is uncovered. It's like gone wild. Her natural beauty, in a sense, is uncovered, and it's represented by uncovering her hair. And a Nazir, that's the one side of it. On the one side of it, it's the nature uncontrolled, wild. On the other hand, somebody who's uncontrolled and nature is flowing in, it could be the natural need for sexuality in the case of the sota, or it could be the natural kedusha, the holiness, the spirituality, which flows from above to a nazir or to a nazirah, to a man or a woman who becomes a nazir, and therefore their hair represents spirituality. Just like you think of the Marishi on the mountain, and his hair, you think of him as long growing hair, because he's not cutting his hair. He's just, everything flows through him or her, and there's absolutely no controls needed. It's just pure spirituality, pure nature flowing within them. So it's either on the positive side or on the negative side. And therefore we see that happening with a Nazir, is that's considered spirituality. On the other hand, what happens is that when you have that uncontrolled flow, it doesn't always end up in spirituality. Sometimes it ends up in licentiousness. Sometimes it ends up in inappropriate behavior. And sometimes you see that actually with religious figures who are very spiritual and turn out to have kind of seedy side to them, because it might be the same forces which push sort of the spirituality, and also push sort of wild and uncontrolled nature of a human being. And therefore, it could be what the Nazir is saying is, the Nazir is saying, I want to be extra spiritual. I want to be devoted to God. And therefore, he separates from wine. He separates from material, the aspects of living. He doesn't want to be associated with death. And he lets that spirituality flow through him, and his hair grows. But there's also has to be an end to that. We'll talk about Samson afterwards, but there has to be an end to that. And because if you let that go too long, it could become a problem. So we have to create a balance. And the balance is that when you stop being a Nazir, then we cut your hair, we show control. So cutting your hair is showing control. It's showing that you're not letting everything just flow naturally. There's a certain balance. And sometimes you take it to the extreme. So some people cut their hair very short. So in the army, they're cutting their hair very short. They're showing there's authority here, there's control. And skinheads are showing like we're powerful. On the other hand, we sometimes allow normal growth of hair, and just to cut it in a normal, balanced way. In other words, yes, there's spirituality, there's nature, there's beauty, but we're not just wild. We're not just letting things just go without any boundaries. So we cut our hair, but we don't necessarily shave it off, but we don't let it grow too wild. In a sense, so that's one way to create balance. Perhaps what Hasidim are doing is just showing the balance in another way. One way to have balance is to have your hair growing but not too long. You might have a beard like me and not growing too long. And Hasidim might say just the opposite. In the spiritual form, which is the beard and the payas, which the Torah says that there's some kind of religious reason not to cut your beard and your payas, so that they let that grow wild, and that's their spirituality. And the hair, which represents beauty and sexuality, that they're controlling, right? And so we see that constantly. Right? The hippies were free love, and therefore the hair is growing wild, the beards are growing wild. There's absolutely no control. Samson is an interesting story, because there we're saying, I've been saying that strength is cutting your hair and showing control, but yet Samson's strength comes from his uncontrolled hair. And it's possible that the message of Samson might be that a Nazir, in a sense, in a perfected Nazir, what happens is the hair, the natural beauty and the nature flowing through him is also becomes strength, because it's strength from God. It's not your own strength that you create for yourself by showing authority and showing that you're going to work out and be strong, but rather it's just something that Shimshon or Samson, he didn't necessarily go to the gym to build up his strength. His strength came from his spirituality. And when you look at the story of Samson, you see that he also was going with a lot of women. Why was he with Delilah, who's a Philistine woman? And it's not the first woman. The story tells us he went after his eyes. So in a sense, he had both things going on. He had the strength and the natural strength that came from growing his hair and letting sort of God flow through him. But it also went to the opposite extreme, that he became sort of running after women, strange women that he shouldn't have. And therefore, Samson comes to a tragic end. But the message for us maybe is that there should be balance in our life. That the Nazir is someone that the Torah says is kadosh, is holy. On the other hand, the Gemara tells us that he's a chote, he's a sinner, because he has to bring a sin offering. In other words, balance is important, and if you let things go wild, you could either be a great tzaddik, you could be the most pious, righteous person, and you could be the great Nazir, you could be like Samson, perhaps with the original intention, or you could end up being Samson, who runs after his eyes, and his strength is used just in following his own desires. It happened to be in that case that the Jews gained from some of his strength, that their enemies were killed. But if you read the story, you see it's Samson's enemies. He's worried about himself. And I think what we have to try to attain is a balance in life. We have to let that nature flow through us. we can't necessarily deny beauty, we can't deny sexuality, we can't deny a need for materialism. But on the other hand, we have to make sure that it's controlled. And the same thing is with spirituality. And that balance, hopefully, is what the Torah is looking for when it says, okay, a Nazir wants to do this, but at the end, we have to have some control. The woman, as uncontrolled hair, sometimes has to be stopped also. And hopefully, if we take that lesson to heart, we can lead our lives what the Maimonides calls the Shvil Hazav, the golden mean, the golden path that we take, which is a balance between these two extremes. Good Shabbos.